Welcome to another episode of The Hub. My name is Steve Hinckley. I'm with the Adventure Science Center. And today I'm joined by Ramon Ryan, who is a graduate of Vanderbilt Law School and an associate in the litigation and dispute resolution with Bass, Berry & Sims here in town. But none of that covers why you're here. So tell us why you're here. What is the cool thing that you do that brought you to us today?
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I am here to talk about space law. It's something that I'm very passionate about, and I got involved with it in law school, and it's just a really exciting field right now.
I feel like we're at the emerging side of space law. So first of all, what is it for those of us who aren't really terribly familiar with space law, and how did you get into this thing?
Yeah, so space law is a very broad field. Almost every area of law touches on it. So a few examples: property law. We'll need to decide if a company lands on an asteroid and wants to mine it, what are the property rights there? Who owns that material? Criminal law. Recently, there was an incident on the International Space Station where there was a potential crime that happened. And who has jurisdiction over that? And then the area that I'm very connected to is the regulatory aspect of it. And so that includes licensing, for launching, for, applications with the FCC to be able to position a satellite. So it encompasses a lot of things. And in each of these areas, as you were saying, it's emerging. So we're figuring it all out together right now.
Do you feel like where you are all figuring out the sort of jurisdiction elements of space law as well as the realm of what it's going to cover, do you feel like that's keeping pace with how quickly people are starting to get more into space? I mean, over the last year, we're getting closer and closer to civilian launches into space. And I feel like this is almost sort of like the issue with stem cell research, for example, where the science, the biology went so fast that the laws had to kind of rush to keep up with that advancing science. Are you sort of in the same place now, or do you feel like we're kind of wrapping our heads around this? We're in good shape to be prepared for when these eventualities happen?
It's very much like stem cell research. We are not keeping pace at all. The commercial space industry is moving much quicker than the government can keep up and laws can keep up. So I think that's one of the reasons why I like talking about it so much, is because it's something that we definitely need to think about. Just to give you an example, we had, just a couple of years ago, around 2,000 satellites orbiting the Earth. But now you have companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, different countries who are launching these mega satellite constellations. And just one of those constellations can include over 100,000 satellites. So yes, we're moving very quickly, and so it's good to be thoughtful about what we want as a society as far as rules for the road when it comes to how we interact with space.
And sort of in that realm, then, in your mind, just from your personal opinion, what do you think is the most pressing issue that needs to be addressed in the short term? Like, if you could pick one topic to work on it and put all your energy there, what would that be?
Yeah, so I think the most pressing thing right now is to create a space traffic management system, similar to, an air traffic control system. Currently, the U.S. military handles, basically looking at what's in space. They will issue collision warnings, not just within the U.S., but for instance, when a European Space Agency satellite was going to collide with a SpaceX satellite. They don't want that responsibility. And so Congress has been working to figure out which agency within the government should take that on. It seems like right now it will be the Office of Space Commerce within the Commerce Department. But it's been moving pretty slowly, and it's something that we definitely need to keep track of because, as I said, we have all of these new satellites launching, we have more space debris. All of that needs to be tracked so that we can continue to access space safely.
This is just so fascinating to me because, again, one of the things to me about law is that there are these jurisdictional boundaries that really determine which laws take effect and which ones don't. And when you're in an infinite space, who decides the jurisdiction there? And I'm curious to know, like, with traditional kind of surface-based military things, there's United Nations and other large organizations that are multinational that all kind of agree on certain standards. Is there anything like that for space law, or is every country kind of like, is this the Wild West out there and we're all sort of on our own trying to figure this out? Or who's kind of the larger umbrella that brings all of this together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the 70s, countries came together under the UN to sign the Outer Space Treaty. So that is in existence. But at that time, it was expected that, very small amount of countries would actually have the resources to launch objects or people into space. So the treaty has not aged well because we have many more countries involved in space exploration, and we also have private participants now entering into space. And so the treaty, didn't anticipate for those things. So we do have a bit of a Wild West situation right now, where you have the U.S. kind of taking the lead as far as trying to push for recently the Artemis Accords, which is how we would interact with kind of property and other countries on the moon. And so the U.S. has been encouraging other countries to sign that. Meanwhile, Russia and China are kind of pushing a separate set of rules, and it's kind of in a sense, a bit of a Cold War. And you've got these other countries trying to figure out who they're going to side with on this. I'm not sure how effective the UN will be going forward in regulating space. Personally, I think it'd be great to have an international approach to it. But just from a practical standpoint, I don't know if we can get back to that space.
Wow, that's a huge amount to figure out. And as you said, this is still an emerging field, very much so. And so I'm curious to see where it all goes. I'm really fascinated to know how you came into this world. Like, how did Ramon Ryan get interested in space law, and how did you wind up here where you are today?
Yeah, so I always loved space as a kid. I grew up watching Star Trek and Star Wars, and my favorite movie was Contact growing up with Jodie Foster. And so particularly from that movie, I thought, oh, I should be an astronomer. And then I took an astronomy class and realized how much math was involved. And I'm not the greatest at math. So that was the end of my nascent astronomy career. But I've always really enjoyed the law. And so when I started law school, I really had no idea about space law. And it wasn't until we had a speaker, an attorney from NASA, come speak with us at Vanderbilt Law about his career, and it was so fascinating. And so I talked to him afterwards, and I was just like, this seems like a way where I can marry my interest in space with my interest in law, which I actually am good at. It's not like math. And so he recommended that I start a space law society at Vanderbilt, which I did, and it was a huge success because a lot of people are just interested in space, even if they don't want to do this as their practice. And so, so we had a good amount of members our first year. It's still going on today. And then I wrote an academic piece on a particular issue with the regulation of these mega satellite constellations. And that got attention in the press. And so from that, it just kind of carried forward. I started attending industry conferences. That's kind of how I ended up here.
I love how you so casually say it got some attention in the press. You were published in Scientific American, that's a pretty big deal. And it's fascinating. Again, part of what we love to explore in this series is that intersection between science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, as well as non-traditional fields related to science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And you really straddle both. I mean, to that point of that early passion of yours for space, you've managed to translate that into a career that is working in a very different realm around space. Do you still get fascinated by, the solar eclipse, these kinds of events? Is that still just something extremely important to you?
Yes, absolutely. Still am a huge fan of space, and I just, for instance, most people take a trip after they take the bar exam. So for me last year, I went out to New Mexico by myself and stayed right by the Very Large Array in
Nice.
Socorro, New Mexico.
From contact.
From contact, yeah, I had to be close to it, and just stargazed. It was a fantastic trip.
Yeah, that sounds like a phenomenal place. And I think out in that area is also where some of the recent launches have actually left from.
Yeah, exactly. They have a great spaceport there.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. Well, and it's just interesting to see how more and more of these places are starting to pop up with areas where eventually more and more civilians will get into space. And when are you prepared to go? Is that something that's like on your bucket list of, I have to be a civilian in space at some point, or are you good just to sort of study the law from down here?
I get asked that a lot, and I just remind people that I'm still a lawyer and very cautious, so I probably will not go until all the kinks are worked out. But if that happens in my lifetime, I would love to go.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, one of the things that is also fascinating to me is that here, aside from the science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, and the law, you're also very focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And tell us a little bit about some of the efforts that you're supporting or that you're participating in to make law as well as STEM a more diverse and inclusive space.
Yeah, that's a great question. When I first started law school, I expected that there were not that many opportunities for individuals from my community, from the African American community, from the LGBTQ community, to work in different areas of the law. And being in law school and going through the recruiting process, I quickly learned that there was a huge appetite for attorneys of color, for queer attorneys in the marketplace, and that the issue wasn't so much there, but it was with reaching children when they're in school. I started going to speak at different elementary schools and middle schools in the area, and I realized that for many Black students or for many queer students, they don't know attorneys. And so they just assume that this isn't a profession that's for them. And so by the time that, firms are ready to recruit, the numbers aren't there in law school. We just don't have enough, Black law students or queer law students. And so I think it's really important that, and this isn't just for the law, but for STEAM as well, to reach children, to get that implanted in their mind early. And I think that's why the Adventure Science Center is so fantastic in doing that.
Yeah, I agree with you. From our standpoint, I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of your rationale and your reasoning behind the work that you do there. From our standpoint, there is certainly a moral imperative issue to being as diverse and equitable and inclusive as possible. But kind of similar to you, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, they are at the root of so many solutions to global challenges, whether it's clean air, clean water, access to food. The climate change, of course, is a huge issue and probably the greatest existential threat that we're facing. And the diversity and inclusion piece, again, it's a moral imperative, but it is also about getting as many minds as we possibly can to focus on these challenges so that ultimately we can solve them, right? I mean, if you marginalize a portion of the population, you lose that brain power and the ability to solve the issue. And so I would imagine that part of your efforts are bringing more people into a field to resolve things like who gets to mine that particular asteroid and whose property is that and so forth.
Exactly.
So, yeah, that's awesome. Well, great work there, and we're proud to know you and be a part of that as well. What's one thing about space law that the average person might not know, that as you've gone through this journey of your own, you found that really fascinating? Sort of think about that piece of trivia knowledge that folks could kind of hang on to. What is that?
Yeah, so it's actually involves insurance, which I know sounds very wonky and boring. But so I mentioned the Outer Space Treaty. And so the Outer Space Treaty includes within it provisions for liability if a country's spacecraft damages property. And so, because at the time they thought that it would just be like countries like the US or Russia who would be launching things, they made it so that the launching country was responsible for any damage that was caused. Well, now you have companies like SpaceX, which launches from the United States. So under the Outer Space Treaty, if SpaceX damages property, say in Germany, it's not SpaceX that's liable, it's the United States. And now that we're creating more and more complex systems, like we're talking about these mega satellite constellations that, have hundreds of thousands of satellites within them. If that whole network is destroyed, we're talking, billions upon billions of, amount of damages. And so these countries, I think, are going to want to step back from that. Because they don't want to be on the hook for it. Insurance companies are also leery of covering, that amount of money. So they'll go to a certain point, but then after that, it's up to the country to cover the rest. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see, when we have our first, major space accident that causes damage, how countries are going to react to that.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think about just sort of your basic fender bender in Nashville and how much dispute there is over those types of things. Imagine it on a scale of billions of dollars.
Exactly.
Out in the middle of space.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's phenomenal. I want to talk a little bit about the story that connected us to you. And we sort of found each other, I guess, about a year ago when we launched a contest for Black History Month asking for folks to submit the nomination of somebody that was a respected individual that's connected to the world of science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, and certainly representing the Black community here in Nashville. Well, I'll let you tell a story. How did we find you, or how did you find us?
Well, I was working, I'd worked with an attorney who is on the board here, and she posted about that opportunity. And so I'll explain kind of what was happening with me and during that time period. So I had written an article that was published in the Vanderbilt Journal of Entertainment and Technology Law regarding basically the environmental review of these mega satellite constellation projects. I knew that I was going to write an article on space law, but I didn't know what it was going to be about. And so I literally just started Googling space lawsuit and just tried to see like what was happening in that realm. And I came across an article that talked about SpaceX's mega satellite constellation, which is called Starlink. And this is a constellation that would provide internet service to you wherever you are on the planet. You could be in the middle of the desert and still get internet. And so, it's great for rural communities. There's a lot of positives to it. But there was this issue where the satellites were much brighter than they anticipated. And so for astronomers doing visual astronomy, they were finding streaks in their photos. And so and then there was another issue with the bandwidth that it uses, and there's scientific communities that also use those bandwidths. And the article ended by saying that there was no legal recourse. And so I just wondered, is that actually true? Is there just nothing that can be done here? And so I started talking with some of my professors about this, and my property professor, who's also an expert in environmental law, asked me if the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, which approves these applications to launch satellites, if they followed the National Environmental Policy Act. And so I responded to my professor. I said, I don't know what the National Environmental Policy Act is, and I don't know if they follow it, but I'll get back to you. And so I started researching it. And basically, the National Environmental Policy Act, which is also called NEPA, requires federal agencies to take a hard look at anything, their actions, as well as the actions of others that they're, approving projects for, to see if they have environmental impacts. It doesn't require any specific outcome. It just requires you to follow this process to see what the environmental impact will be for a project. So I looked at what the FCC was doing, and they had a very large, what's called categorical exclusion, meaning that they basically say all of the activities of the FCC have no environmental impact, therefore we just can sidestep this whole law. And so I then looked at NASA, because they also launch satellites, and I found that NASA does do environmental reviews for their satellites. So my question was, if NASA is required to do this,
why doesn't FCC?
Yeah, why doesn't the FCC require, commercial space actors to also do this environmental review? And so in my article, I discussed that issue. I look at the jurisprudence around NEPA, how courts have interpreted it, and I basically said, if someone sued the FCC over this, I think they'd win. And so I was at the time quoting a lot of articles from Scientific American, and I reached out to the author of those articles just to let him know that, I appreciated his work. And so when I mentioned that, he was like, oh, what are you writing about? And I told him, and he was like, actually, I would really like to do a story about that. And so, so he actually wrote the article for Scientific American, then Business Insider picked it up, then Futurism. And then probably about 6 months later, someone on Twitter messaged me and said, hey, did you see this letter that the Senate has sent to the Government Accountability Office? And the letter basically was asking the Government Accountability Office why the FCC is not performing these environmental reviews. And as I went through the letter, it was a lot of points from my article.
This looks a little familiar
Yeah.
to me. Yeah.
So I emailed one of the senators and asked, like, hey, where did you get this from? And I found out that it was from my article. And so we're still waiting on a response from that. And then most recently, Viasat, which is a competitor of SpaceX, has actually sued the FCC and SpaceX over this issue. And it's currently in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. So I will actually get to see if the courts agree with my analysis on this. So it's been very exciting.
That's an amazing story to think that, an article that just came out of your own curiosity could have these huge, far-reaching implications and really set a completely different trajectory, no pun intended, for how that law gets interpreted. And when we did our Black History Month contest, you nominated yourself, which I love. I think that's just brilliant. Because from our standpoint, from the Science Center standpoint, I should say, we're constantly trying to find ways that we can connect what we talk about, the topics that obviously we are finding important to discuss, find those connections in the community. There are some obvious places, right? Observatories, those sorts of things, but there are some very non-traditional spaces where we find people such as yourself who have these incredible careers related to the content, but are very much under the radar. Very few people may know about these types of things. And so it was exciting to us that you said, I know somebody for that nomination. It would be myself. And we're thrilled to get connected to you.
I'm not shy about about this topic.
About anything.
Yeah. And so, and like you said, it is something that just is kind of under the radar. And so, any opportunity that I have, I like to share that to discuss this topic. And when I was editor-in-chief of JET Law, which is the Vanderbilt Journal of Entertainment and Technology Law, and I would talk about my article and kind of where it went, I always stress that I don't share that story to say, like, I'm so amazing. Yeah. I share it to show that if you're passionate about something, you can have an impact even as a student. And I think that, as going back to the whole conversation about diversity, that was another emphasis of the journal too, is we wanted to open up scholarship to more diverse viewpoints, because as you said, that's how we're going to be able to solve these problems.
Right. And I love the fact that you are aware that your ability to speak about what you do could influence others. And it really is about creating more opportunities for other individuals. And so one final question that I would have for you is, I don't know how much you think about this, but if you were to give yourself advice, when you were 10 years old or whatever, our typical audience is going to be families with kids, usually in that age range. And so if you're talking to a young Ramon, what is that advice that you give yourself that helps others understand how they can become you?
Yeah, I think I would tell myself to follow my passion, and to not assume that maybe because I don't have the traditional characteristics of someone in a certain field, that I can't be a part of that field. And that's certainly been true for me, and I'm thankful that attorney from NASA came and spoke at Vanderbilt Law, because I may not have learned that, I could have, an impact in the scientific community, in a field that I'm passionate about, which is law. And I think that's true for others. So yeah, I hope that, parents encourage their children to follow their passion wherever it takes them. And even if they don't think that they have, a traditional role in the scientific community of, being like a biologist, that there's room for everyone here in science and in space.
Well, I love that message. And that's so much about the Science Center's role as well, is just inspiring that passion and encouraging people to continue pursuing that and finding that curiosity that ultimately drives it forward. Well, I want to thank you for being here today and
Thanks
spending
for having
this time.
me.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for spending time with us. Thank you for all you're doing to help us figure out how we're going to sort of journey into that next frontier, and then certainly how that next generation of young individuals is going to follow in your footsteps and help us solve some of these big challenges. So thank you, Ramon. It's good to talk with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.